Right now we've got Michael Pettersson, who has travelled from Canberra to be with us this weekend. Thanks very much, Michael. I think it's your first time at MardiGrass. We've got, veteran politicians, but it's nice to get some fresh ones as well. So Michael in particular is very exciting and interesting because he has managed some really great achievements with drug law reform in ACT, and I know that the territories are a bit different to the states, so you have sometimes a different type of leeway to make a difference or a change. And Michael is also one of Australia's youngest politicians, and he was you were elected when you were 25 years old. Is that right? Yeah. So, and used social media to sort of, tap into the youth. And so congratulations on doing that. And Michael is basically going to talk about what he has achieved in ACT, and I'm sure it'll generate a lot of discussion. So thank you, Michael.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and it is very exciting to be here. This is my first time in Nimbin. For a few years now, I've been invited up here, but for the first time, calendars have lined up, and here I am. And all I can say is I've thoroughly enjoyed it so far. The characters out on display definitely make for an exciting weekend, especially for a boring guy like me from Canberra. I'm here to talk to you today about the important reforms that have been taking place in the Australian Capital Territory for a long time. And immediate audience question, is anyone here from the Australian Capital Territory? As I expected, no. So I'm going to have to start the presentation with a bit of history just to get you all up to speed on the journey that ACT has been undertaking for a long time. So the Australian Capital Territory is a new jurisdiction. We've only had self-government for 30 years. Till that time, decisions were ultimately made through the Commonwealth Parliament. But about 30 years ago, the Commonwealth Parliament passed laws to give the Australian Capital Territory self-government. And with that, created the ACT Legislative Assembly, of which I am now very proudly a member. Now, the new Legislative Assembly got to work on some really important issues straight away. In 1991, the ACT Legislative Assembly created a select committee on HIV, illegal drugs and prostitution. And importantly, it published an interim report called Marijuana and Other Illegal Drugs. Now, the reason I'm telling you this, one, for the backstory, but two, just to reiterate that the work that has been undertaken in ACT recently stands on the shoulders of the giants that came before us. The people 30 years ago that stood up and fought for these important reforms. So the committee found all of the things that you would expect, all the things that we all know. The war on drugs isn't working. Trying to police our way out of this issue isn't solving anything. Police, courts are wasting their time going after individual users of cannabis. So they came up with a recommendation. They said that cannabis should be decriminalised in the Australian Capital Territory in 1992. And they did it. The ACT Legislative Assembly, a new parliament, decriminalised the possession of small amounts of cannabis. Now, the original scheme had some certain limits to it. You could possess 25 grams of dried cannabis and you could grow 5 plants. Reasonable enough for most people, and those laws stood for over a decade. If you were caught with those quantities, the drugs would be confiscated and you'd be issued a fine, a $100 fine. Now, those laws were in place for over a decade until they were changed. And the reforms are kind of funny, and it goes to the inherent nature of politics. And it's only when you kind of hear these stories that you kind of get to laugh about how absurd some of these things are. So for most of you, you probably had a bit of a laugh when I said that the quantity of cannabis was set at 25 grams, because one of the most common amounts of cannabis purchased is, of course, 28 grams. But the politicians at the time when this problem was pointed out to them, said, well, we can't be too good to these people, you know? We can't be seen to be too friendly to people using cannabis. So if we're going to increase the quantity of cannabis you can possess, well, then we're going to have to horse trade with that. And so to increase the quantity of cannabis you can possess, they then reduce the number of plants you can possess. I do not joke. That's quite literally how laws are made sometimes. Now, those laws came into place in 2005, and then for 13 years, our cannabis laws, for the most part, went untouched, till I came along. I was first elected to the ACT Legislative Assembly in 2016. A young guy, as mentioned. I was 25 when I was first elected, and I'm still a reasonably young guy by my measure. Increasingly not so, which is a terrifying thought. But I was in my first term. I was part of a Labor government, and I came to the realisation that our cannabis laws were not in line with community expectations. Now, this wasn't a revolutionary thought for me because for most of my life, I'd always thought that the war on drugs was kind of silly. I love to tell this story about how my views on drug law were formed. And they were formed in the bedroom of a moody teenager spending too much time watching YouTube videos. And I saw someone shout out earlier about law enforcement against prohibition. Well, law enforcement against prohibition was so formative in my views because I used to watch YouTube videos at home after school of these retired cops going on cable TV shows explaining how the war on drugs was a terrible idea. And as a 16-year-old kid with too much time on your hands, you just think, these ex-cops, coolest guys ever. So I had those views from quite an early age. But when I ran for election, it didn't even cross my mind once to talk about drug law reform. Quite literally, a very active young person involved in politics that had managed to find themselves as pre-selected for a political party, not once when I was running for election did it even cross my mind to talk about drug law reform. It was only during my first term, talking to people out in the community, talking to my staff, when it kind of dawned on us that, well, if we believe these things, if we know that people in the community share this sentiment, well, why hasn't anyone done something about this yet? We live in the most progressive jurisdiction in Australia. I'm surrounded by many progressive colleagues of various political parties. And we kind of just pondered. I was like, surely someone else is going to do this. Like, I'm the new kid on the block. There's a bunch of more senior, more experienced, more competent, more professional politicians than me. Surely one of them will do something. Until the penny truly dropped, in which it was like, all right, well, if no one else is going to do this, I'm going to do this, which is where the Drugs of Dependence Personal Cannabis Use Amendment Bill 2018 comes into existence. As I'm sure you've read now based on the PowerPoint slide, it would allow for individuals to possess 50 grams of cannabis as well as 2 plants per person to a household limit of 4. In reforming our laws to allow people to use and possess cannabis, you also had to kind of create some new rules, which people don't often think about when you try to legalise cannabis. Well, you actually have to then create a regulatory framework. So we had to put in a few, I think, important safeguards, make sure that cannabis consumed in private, away from kids, it's stored in a secure manner away from kids, and also to make sure that people, this was a funny consideration at the time, make sure that people didn't decide to grow cannabis plants on public property. So a few rules that we had to put in place. Now, I think it's important to just talk about the fact that drug law reform is not always the most popular topic. But in the ACT, it is. This was polling undertaken by the ACT government in, I'm stretching my memory, I think 2019. So it's a bit out of date, and there hasn't been any more polling done on this issue since. But I would go so far as to claim quite boldly that the ACT is the most progressive jurisdiction in Australia. And this is probably also some of the most extensive polling ever done on the community views on cannabis in the country anywhere. And as you can see, it is popular. The headline figure across all of the different age groups was that 54% of Canberrans supported legalising the possession of cannabis for personal use, with only 27% opposed, the remainder neither. There's a couple of other observations I'd make about this polling. Often people characterise drug law reform as an issue for young people. Partly true. But the surprising thing for me is the very strong support for the 35 and 44-year-olds in the ACT. They are the strongest supporters and also have the lowest levels of opposition, which is important to point out because that actually pops up in some further polling. The other observation I'd make, and this one surprised me when it first popped up, 18 to 24-year-olds are not the most excited about these reforms. The media would characterise, I think unfairly, that young people are obsessed with partying, recreational drugs. I don't think the polling actually reflects that, but it's important to note they do still have strong levels of support. So, not to kind of ruin the ending of this, we did successfully pass the bill. The vote was 14 to 11. That was all members of the Australian Labor Party in the ACT Legislative Assembly. The 2 members of the Greens all voted in support. Then the Canberra Liberals opposition all voted against. Now, passing the bill was probably the most exciting time in my political life because the phone in my office did not stop ringing for 3 days. So let that be a lesson to any other politicians. The reaction was pretty full on because making a couple of gross assumptions about everyone's interest in Australian politics, most people don't pay attention to the politics of the Australian Capital Territory. Most people like to forget the Australian Capital Territory exists. So for many people across the country, when the ACT Legislative Assembly did vote to pass these laws, it was actually the first time they ever heard about it. Ignoring the fact that this bill had been released for over a year, had gone through a very public committee inquiry process for about 6 or 9 months. So most people only found out about it after we'd passed it. And the response was pretty full on from the then Liberal National Government. A few of the highlights, and I hope some of you can recall these at the time because they are quite genuinely ridiculous. Greg Hunt, the former health minister, threatened that the bill may be inconsistent with international law and threatened to take the ACT government to the United Nations. The ex-Attorney General, Christian Porter, threatened to use Commonwealth laws to prosecute and go after cannabis users and described the laws as crazy. Deputy Prime Minister Michael McCormack said that the new laws were dopey and accused the ACT government of smoking too much cannabis. And of course, Peter Dutton got in on it as well, describing the new laws as dangerous and unconscionable. Very rich from Peter Dutton. So the then federal Liberal government were definitely the most outrageous in their opposition, but I wanted to showcase the local opposition that I had to contend with for the year that we were progressing the laws. Now I hope that this video works.
The ACT has become the first Australian jurisdiction to legalise the personal use and cultivation of cannabis. But police would still be able to charge someone with cannabis possession under federal law. So there's a bit of a grey area there. Joining me now is the ACT's Shadow Attorney General, Jeremy Hansen. Jeremy Hansen, thanks very much for joining us this morning. Good to be with you. First of all, why legalise cannabis?
Well, we shouldn't be is the answer to that. I think it's sending the wrong message. It's condoning the use of cannabis, and as the AMA will tell you, it can cause a 5-fold risk in the incidence of psychosis. It's creating confusion around the conflict between Commonwealth law and ACT law, of course, the problems with drug driving remain. So it's been a pretty poor exercise. It's bad legislation. There's still confusion out there. I think all it's going to do is cause problems for our police force out there who are trying to actually manage the balance between ACT laws and Commonwealth laws. It's going to cause more people to drug drive. And what we're going to see, as we've seen in other jurisdictions that have gone down this path overseas, you get to see more hospital presentations from mental illness and other concerns that arise with cannabis use.
All right, so that's what I had to go up against most days for about a year. As many of you would know, a lot of those talking points were disingenuous at best. However, the debate and consideration of the bill did lead to some fun things. This is my favourite clip from the process.
Marijuana law reform that has this ACT Labor backbencher nicknamed the sickest white boy in the game. But Michael Pettersson says his proposal to remove cannabis from the ACT's legal definition of a prohibited substance is no laughing matter.
So all I can hope is that the journalist that came out with that one had a good time that day, because I still laugh about it every day. So we passed the laws. The Conservatives were very unhappy. The question then immediately turned to, will and should the Commonwealth Government overturn these reforms in the ACT? Because, a civics lesson for everyone, territories do not enjoy the same protections and status as a state. Territories are formed through the Commonwealth Parliament. So the ACT Legislative Assembly derives all of its powers from the ACT Self-Government Act. So the Commonwealth Government can interfere in several ways. The most famous instance of the Commonwealth Government interfering with a territory is, of course, euthanasia in the Northern Territory in the 90s, which resulted in then Conservative member of the Federal Parliament, Kevin Andrews, proposing what's now known as the Andrews Bill, which is currently being considered for repeal in the current Parliament. In essence, what the Commonwealth Parliament did back in the 90s was pass an amendment to the Northern Territory Self-Government Act, which essentially changed the Self-Government Act from saying the Northern Territory will exist, the Northern Territory will have judges and a parliament, to the Act saying the Northern Territory will exist, it will have judges, it will have a parliament, and also, just by the way, they will not be allowed to make any laws relating to end-of-life matters. The other way that the Commonwealth Parliament can interfere comes from the Constitution. Section 122 of the Constitution says, the Parliament may make laws for the government of any territory surrendered by any state to and accepted by the Commonwealth. So they could just vote to say, no thanks. The other thing that also needs to be considered is that because territories derive all of their power from the Commonwealth Parliament, because we're created by them, all of our powers are an extension of the Commonwealth Parliament. So there's a little quirk to that, in that because we derive our power from the Commonwealth Parliament, we're not allowed to say, our laws are not allowed to contradict what Commonwealth law says. If it does, it's called something called an invalid law, and we'll come back to that a bit later. On just a slight tangent as well, some of you might have also been aware in 2013 the Australian Capital Territory legislated for same-sex marriage. This often gets brought up in the context of territory rights. Slightly different issue. The ACT Legislative Assembly legislated same-sex marriage. We got taken to the High Court. The High Court ruled, rightly, that marriage was an issue for the federal parliament, not for the states and territories. So we were in the wrong on that one, but we kind of knew that doing it. So anyway, to the polling that you've been looking at for a couple of minutes, when Australians were asked, should the ACT's cannabis laws be overturned, resoundingly, they said no. Now, I wouldn't confer from those polls outright support for cannabis legalisation in your own jurisdictions, but it's probably a combination of respect for democratic rights and cannabis law reform. And I said I'd come back to it, but once again, those 35 to 49-year-olds really coming home strong for the team, with the highest levels of support once again. So this is not a young people's issue. This is an issue that is cared about by many different age groups. So, can anyone remember what the Canberra Liberals opposition spokesperson said? He had a couple of different stats that he rolled out and said that the sky was going to fall down in the ACT. Well, the data from the ACT is, for lack of a better word, boring. Nothing changed. The sky did not fall in. No increase in cannabis-related hospital presentations. Wastewater analysis showed that cannabis use remained completely consistent with other jurisdictions. There was no increase in drug driving related to cannabis. Now, everyone says whenever you change the law about drugs, their use will go up. It's just not true. Generally speaking, and it's a generalisation, but most people that want to use cannabis right now. The law does not stop them. All the law does is punishes the people that are unlucky enough to get caught. But there's a big asterisk on a lot of this data, and it's kind of a funny one because the laws were passed in 2019, but they came into effect in January 31 of 2020. So very quickly, the whole world stopped caring about cannabis in the ACT, and we started caring about other things. So if you ever get the chance, and I do regret not including it, but if you ever look at the wastewater analysis of Australians' drug consumption throughout COVID-19 and the subsequent restrictions, there are some funky things going on with drug consumption across the country. Moving on, I just want to touch on a few other exciting things that have taken place in the ACT. Not strictly related to cannabis, but we'll come back to cannabis in questions, but this is really important stuff and I want to talk about it. The ACT government has recently implemented a drug checking service, a fixed site drug checking service. For a couple of years, we've had a trial being undertaken at music festivals in the ACT, but we finally pulled the trigger and committed to a fixed site, and this is not controversial. In the ACT, 70% of residents support drug checking, compared to the country at 56%. Then when it comes to opposition, in the ACT, only 18% of Canberrans are opposed to drug checking, compared to 27% across Australia. So this issue is not controversial in the ACT, and the service is displaying some really interesting results. I just want to check, can people, it's not up, can we get the slides up? Now, can the people in the back read that? Because I didn't have a good way to present this in a graph. Yes? Okay. So, everyone make sure you read the data, because it's kind of funny. The big high-level observation I would make about the drugs that are getting consumed in the Australian Capital Territory is that they are not the drugs people think they are. Now, I'm not completely oblivious to the fact that Canberra is an inland city, probably at the end of a very long journey that these drugs have gone through to get to us. So I do understand that along the way some of these substances will have been cut with other things, but the extent is shocking, quite genuinely shocking. The other thing that I'd point out, I've gone and I've had a tour of this facility. The sample that was 100% sugar, that was said to be methamphetamine, there is a reasonable explanation for that. They believe it was someone that was trialling the service and wanted to check they weren't going to get in trouble. So we can only hope, just for their own benefit, that they didn't get completely scammed. Now, the other important thing that's underway in the ACT is my second private member's bill. I introduced a bill in 2021 to the ACT Legislative Assembly to decriminalise the possession of small amounts of common illicit drugs. And since that time, that bill has been progressing slowly but steadily through the ACT Legislative Assembly and is coming up for a vote in the coming weeks. Nope, that's not the slide I thought it was going to be. So how will drug decriminalisation work in the ACT? What is the framework that we are going to have in place? In essence, it's very similar to the decriminalisation that exists in the ACT for cannabis for 25 plus years. In essence, you get caught with a drug, it's confiscated, you get given a fine. But there is some nuance to it, and it's important for the health professionals in the room. So, first step, police confiscate the substance. Police can then use their discretion to issue a fine or a referral to a drug diversion program. A simple drug offence notice may be issued once the drugs have been identified in a laboratory. Individuals eligible for the $100 simple drug offence notice will have the option to pay or discharge the offence by a diversion to assessment, drug education, or a drug treatment program. If someone is found in possession of a larger quantity of a substance, the individual will remain open to prosecution, but the criminal penalties will be greatly reduced. If an individual carries 99% of the proposed personal limit of each of the two listed drugs, they are eligible for a simple drug offence notice. If they carry smaller amounts of multiple drugs, adding to less than 2 proportions, they would similarly be eligible. However, if an individual carries either 101% or higher of the limit of any one drug, or 201% across 2 or more drugs, they revert to only being eligible for standard drug possession penalties, not the reduced penalties in the bill. Producing, trafficking, supplying, selling still all remain criminal. Now, in many places, this would be very controversial. However, in the ACT, it's not. A recent poll commissioned by Uniting found that nearly 80% of Canberrans supported some combination of decriminalisation actions. Only 1 in 10 Canberrans support imprisonment for drug possession. 2 in 10 suggest no action or a caution for some of the most common party substances. Now, I said at the start, the ACT is probably one of the most progressive jurisdictions in Australia, and data from the Australian Institute of Health and Wellbeing kind of backs this up. This polling does replicate their line of questioning. But Canberra's progressive on this issue, but we're not that much more progressive than most of the country. This data is quite close to what you'll see in your own home state. Now, the next bit of polling was some specific to the substance polling that the ACT government undertook. So for cocaine, there's a reasonably strong result for a fine, caution or nothing, minimal support for prison. Hallucinogens, once again, strong support for fine, caution or nothing. Still polling well, and also prison still remaining low. And if anyone needs, we can come back to these, but I want to get to the end to get to questions. For meth or an amphetamine, there's a large jump for education or treatment. However, there's also a large jump for prison. So clearly very polarising, and much the same for heroin. Now, last one, ecstasy, very similar response to cocaine and hallucinogens. Fines, caution or nothing, prison support low. So I want to wrap up just by kind of summarising the ACT experience. Drug law reform in the ACT is probably the easiest place in the country to have these reforms. And when it comes to cannabis, how many years after the fact are we talking now? 2 years or so? Cannabis is a non-issue in the ACT. The Canberra Liberals took to the 2020 ACT election a policy that they were going to overturn the cannabis laws, haven't said a single thing about it after the election. The sky's yet to fall in, and cannabis users in the ACT get to sleep a little bit easier. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Michael. If you have questions, put up your hand and we'll come and see you.
Michael, can you hear me?
Yes.
My name's Craig Ellis. Firstly, thanks very much for all the fantastic work you're doing down the ACT. What I'm interested in, and you touched on it at the end there, that it was a private members bill, and so it was a cannabis one as well, of course. I'm interested in understanding the interaction that you've had with being a Labor Party member, of course, with your other Labor Party MPs. I imagine, of course, it was a conscious vote at the end of the day, but interactions with Labor MPs at the federal level and New South Wales and Victoria, because the whole pathway, of course, of getting drugs and getting cannabis legalised, it's going to be very important to get the major parties across the line, and Labor in particular. So that's my question.
It's a very good question. I have had a large number of politicians from many different political parties reach out to me over the years to talk about drug law reform, particularly cannabis. Most states, federal and state, and I would broadly make this comment. There are many politicians in this country that are pretty switched on. And most of the politicians in this country have seen the evidence for drug law reform. Now, for many of them, they might be considering wider political circumstances for why they might not be forthcoming with their support. And it's very frustrating to hear, but Australia is quite a conservative country. In regards to the position of federal Labor, and this isn't something I kind of raised with them, they're very busy, they're doing lots of important things, and in the ACT, we're quietly and diligently undertaking the work that needs to be done. The position that has always been reiterated to me is that the Federal Labor Party considers drug law reform an issue for states and territories.
Thanks, Michael, for all your hard work. You've done a great job. I just want to say, is there any chance of expanding the ACT borders?
It's very funny you say that, because for the first time, the ACT has actually just increased the size of the territory, because the New South Wales has just ceded some land to us. So the ACT is growing very slowly.
Have you got any data on patterns of drug use? I wonder whether the legalisation of cannabis in the ACT has changed the proportion of people that use cannabis.
It's a good question. I haven't seen any data that showcases that. I'll put an asterisk on it as well, because COVID has quite literally warped drug consumption patterns right across the country. So, for example, during lockdown, cannabis use spiked right across the country in a remarkable way. The flip side to that is more common illicit party drugs like cocaine or MDMA absolutely plummeted. So I'm yet to see any concrete data about increased use. However, I know there's a range of academic studies in the field, in the ACT right now, so the answer will be there soon. In the very back.
I was just wondering how you decided on the weights for the decriminalisation bill. It seems a little strange you can have 0.5 gram of MDMA but 2 grams of heroin or meth. There may have been 1 or 2, but how did you decide on those?
No, you were right with the numbers. The list of drugs and their quantities are not scientific. And I say that for a couple of reasons. They're a combination of substances that there was publicly available polling for community sentiment on the appropriate response, as well as examples from other jurisdictions overseas where they'd been decriminalised. For the quantities, they were derived from where Commonwealth law might still consider that possession personal. Now, it's a bit of a vague concept to most people, but under our drug laws, you've got different quantities of drugs, and the severity of the punishment will change based on how much drugs you've got. There's an important distinction that when you have larger quantities, the authorities can assume that you are a trafficker, and the onus is on you to disprove that. So for Commonwealth law, those thresholds are set very low and not particularly well informed by evidence. So, as rightfully pointed out, MDMA is currently 0.5 grams in the private members bill. And the reason I've done that, because that's where the threshold is set under Commonwealth law for personal possession. The reason that is so important is because it was touched upon earlier with the session with Senator Shoebridge, is that individual police get to make very consequential decisions about what happens to you. So in the ACT, something I'm still somewhat nervous about, still in regards to cannabis, but I'll come back to this after this point, is that an individual police officer could say, I could give you the fine, or I could charge them for a trafficable quantity of an illicit substance under Commonwealth law. And I don't want any Canberran to be going out on a Friday night thinking that they're going to have a great time and they don't have to risk going to jail, and Saturday morning they're thinking they're going through the Commonwealth justice system as a drug trafficker. So it is frustrating. However, there is an amendment being proposed to increase the quantity of MDMA. I think that will get up. However, I don't think it's very likely for various reasons, but I think it's something that needs to be considered, that Commonwealth law still exists. And then the second point I want to make was in regards to cannabis. So one of the big issues that was kind of debated as the ACT considered cannabis law reform, and it was mentioned in the clip of the Conservative, was that the Commonwealth government could still prosecute people under Commonwealth law. Cannabis was going to be illegal under ACT law. I'll put an asterisk next to that for a couple of reasons, and I'll come back to that. But under Commonwealth law, it would still be illegal. Now, you need to think of the law as not just a list of offences, but also a list of defences. So, for example, if you were to punch someone, that's assault. But if you were to punch someone in self-defence, not assault. So when it comes to Commonwealth drug possession offences, you've got your drugs and you've got the quantities, there's also some defences. Now, one of the defences to a Commonwealth drug possession charge is that the use is excused or justified by a state or territory law. There's also another defence that most people don't know about, and this goes to some of the language that I use when talking about this reform. If someone reasonably believes their excuse is excused or justified by a state or territory law, that would also provide a defence to the Commonwealth drug possession charge. So, to combine a few different thoughts here, the Australian Capital Territory is a territory and our laws cannot conflict with the Commonwealth. So the Commonwealth says that cannabis is illegal. It's kind of game, set, match. The law the ACT has to have on the books can't say the opposite. So in a very technical legal sense, cannabis would still be considered illegal in the ACT. But, wink wink, we've crafted our laws in such a way to allow individuals to possess and grow cannabis at home. And so it's a very important question as to the legality of cannabis that's never going to get tested, because the Commonwealth government will refuse to ever bring this forward because they know they will lose. So the Commonwealth government currently enjoys the kind of ambiguous state that cannabis in the ACT hangs in, but it doesn't really change the on-the-ground experience for most users of cannabis in Canberra. They grow, possess cannabis, and they don't worry about police. In front.
Yes. My question really follows on from that. In terms of the on-the-ground policing, I understand there's been no prosecutions under the Commonwealth law since the ACT changed its cannabis laws a couple of years ago, 2 years plus, whatever it is. So I think that can be confirmed. But secondly, just on the ground in terms of policing behaviour by federal police, has your office or is there any other information about, are they using that as a threat? Are police kind of waving their powers around in terms of dealing with individual people who might be or may not be cannabis users?
I've got two anecdotes that go to different experiences, and they're both very funny. So the first one, and it's definitely the funnier of the two, I had someone get in touch with my office recently to talk about their cannabis plants getting stolen. They've been growing cannabis plants in their backyard, and someone had come through and stolen them, and I was kind of waiting for the next penny to drop, where they were going to be very angry and upset at the world, but they were actually wanting to say how happy they were that the cannabis plants had been stolen. And I was kind of a bit confused, like, what's going on here? And then they hit me with the next part of the story, that the cannabis plants had been stolen, and then they'd called up the cops to report that their cannabis plants had been stolen. And the cop very dutifully and politely took the report in, saying that their cannabis plants had been stolen. So there's definitely, I think, a very productive approach that gets undertaken by ACT Police. Police are very engaged with the community. No police force is perfect, but ACT Police have a pretty good track record of doing a pretty good job. The other side of the spectrum that I've heard, and this also goes to a legal, some little legalese that's quite funny, and maybe some of you can speak to this experience. If your drugs are confiscated by police, they don't have to give them back to you. It's considered evidence, but there's a range of laws that have been written over many years that mean drugs, even if you're found guilty of whatever the drug charge was, the drugs don't get given back to you. Now, I have heard some anecdotes of police seizing cannabis as evidence of a range of different crimes, and then using that legal technicality, having the cannabis destroyed, and they didn't get it back. However, there was no fine, there was no interaction with the criminal justice system, just the cops took their cannabis and got rid of it.
Thanks, Michael. I was going to say there's two last questions. Lady at the front first.
Yes.
No, please use the mic because we're recording. Up, yep. Up, who will help?
Okay, here we go. So, you're a very impressive man. Really impressive. And it's not often that I get to see a politician who I actually can relate to, because there's this, because they're assholes, most of them. And you're not, so thank you. So my question is this. I live in Sydney, and I would really like you to consider moving to New South Wales and being part of the New South Wales government, or later on moving to federal Labor and being part of a federal conversation. Because we need people like you who are actually in touch with the community of all ages to come along and actually lead, as opposed to be all about their political career. So there's some lovely places in Sydney you can move to. So could you do that soon, please?
I've got a counter offer for you. Have you ever considered moving to Canberra?
No.
I feel like we're in an impasse then, I'm sorry.
Okay, one last question.
Thank you, I'm very flattered. There's, I think, a terrible track record of people involved in politics trying to plan their future. Politics is half about skill, it's also half about luck. You never know what opportunities are going to pop up. So who knows, maybe. The other thing that I'd just add is that there are some people that love being a politician. There are some people that really like sitting in the front row. They like seeing their face on TV or in a newspaper. That is not me. I am a politician because I deeply care about making my community a better place. But I don't know how some people remain politicians for such a long time. Because it's really hard, it's really draining. Today is a Saturday. I'm not hanging out with my friends. I didn't have a sleep in. I was kind of off doing work things. So it's tough. So who knows, maybe I might one day, but also I don't think I can be a politician for my entire life. I would like to do something different at some point, but Maybe. Who knows? One day.
Thank you.
Just
Okay.
one quick comment question. Thanks for everything that you've done so far in getting the laws across. I noticed there's actually a government-sponsored How to Grow Cannabis clinic being done, I believe, in the next couple of weeks down in Canberra, which is absolutely fantastic. But that highlights a very important point of the seed and being able to get quality seed. There's no sense in teaching people how to grow something if they can't get quality seed. I realise it's going to be a problem that you're not going to be able to get the seeds through because of federal thing, but perhaps addressing that so that people can exchange their private genetics with other people in a legal sense.
Yes, it's a very good question, and I do remiss that I didn't actually include it in the presentation. But the question of supply is probably one of the most constant questions I get, and it's a genuine question to a real problem. The short answer is we looked, we tried, and we know it's a problem. If you want confirmation of this, next time you've got your smartphone out, do some Googling of the comments of ACT Labor Chief Minister Andrew Barr, who said that he was in favour of a legal, regulated, taxed marketplace. But we looked and we tried to legislate a model that would have some form of supply, try and deal with some of those wider issues of an illicit black market. But we kind of brushed up on some of those territory rights issues they talked about before. We can't have conflicting laws with the Commonwealth. You also then run into an interesting question about this idea of taxing the marketplace, because under the Constitution, only the Commonwealth Government can have duties to generate tax. So would be, in essence, trying to create this system that would really just be legalising the black market, but also not being able to properly create a regulated and I would say mostly law-abiding provider. However, there's a certain point that I'd like to point out to everyone that I can. The main offences that most people need to consider when consuming drugs are possession offences and supply offences. Possession and supply. Now, read between the lines.
Wow, thank you so much, Michael. That's really... thank you so much, Michael. It's a really great talk and a lot of hopefully inspiration for us to try to get some movement in New South Wales, even without you moving to Sydney. So, thank you.